Welcomed or Excluded? Exploring America's Immigration History. If America is a nation built by immigrants, how can some be included and some be excluded? Immigration has always been a big part of the U.S. identity, helping shape many communities, society, and the economy, but not all groups being treated in equal ways. Throughout history, laws and policies have raised questions regarding who is able to belong and why. In this video, we will explore U.S. immigration history through comparison of well-known and overlooked immigrant groups. We will look at how laws and politics shape who can be welcomed and who will be shut out, as well as what this reveals about American values. We will examine the basis of regions and how different groups were treated differently from others, from Asians to Hispanics, Caribbeans, and Europeans. We will explore how race, labor demands, and political agendas have shaped each group's experiences. Our historical question for the video is, to what extent did U.S. immigration policies and foreign relations shape which ethnic groups were welcomed or excluded for immigrating in large numbers, and how do the experiences of overlooked or lesser-known immigrant groups reveal deeper truths about American values and global perspectives? Let's start off with one of the most defining and restrictive immigration laws in U.S. history, the Chinese Exclusion Act. In the spring of 1882, U.S. Congress passed and President Chester A. Arthur signed the act, being the first ever federal law to completely ban an entire ethnic group from immigrating to the U.S. This act had created a 10-year absolute ban on Chinese laborers to enter the United States. This law was not placed to prevent crimes or direct threats to the people, but rather to, quote, protect the good order of the local communities, as the law stated. The Chinese immigrants had been seen as a disrupting pest in economic and social order, primarily due to their willingness to accept lower wages, and were blamed for causing job competition in labor-intensive positions such as mining and railroad construction. But if no crime had been committed, why was this law passed? Well, essentially, this had demonstrated the economic fear and deep passion for racial prejudice. Many Americans had believed in the idea that the Chinese laborers had lowered their own wages and taken their jobs, but also that simply they did not fit into the American culture. This law marked a turning point as it demonstrated how the U.S. government could use race as a tool to control immigration in a discriminatory way. The government was permitted to determine who could be welcomed based on whether they were seen as threats to the national identity and domestic identity of its people. The Exclusion Act did not just place boundaries on the people attempting to enter the country, but also those who had already been living there. If a Chinese resident had left the U.S. and wanted to return, they had faced strict re-entry requirements. They would need to obtain a special re-entry certification, which other immigrant groups had not been required to do. To make matters worse, the Chinese immigrants and residents had been legally barred from becoming U.S. citizens, denying them of penal rights and protections. So while they were able to be deported by the government, they were never guaranteed full membership in American society. This demonstrates that this was not just an exclusion act, but also something that impacted those inside the country as well. Now, although the law had technically been able to make some exceptions, those who had been non-laborers or merchants still had the ability to apply. Even exempt groups faced major difficulties and conflicts in the immigration process. Now, to bypass this, they needed to obtain a certificate from their own government that said that they met the requirements in order to immigrate. However, even with the certification and meeting the requirements, the law's vague and unclear definitions made it unclear on who was actually banned, which essentially closed the door on all Chinese applicants for immigration. Now, let's dive into a law which had redefined an entire people from U.S. nationals to aliens almost overnight, the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934. This piece of legislation had dramatically changed Filipino immigration by taking away the ability of U.S. nationals from Filipinos and then placing strict limits on how many immigrants can enter the United States, even though the Philippines had remained a U.S. colony. After being passed by Congress in 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Act declared that Filipinos will now be treated as aliens and foreigners who would now be subject to immigration quotas and visa requirements. Prior to the law, Filipinos were considered U.S. nationals because of America's colonial rule, which has allowed them easier access to America. However, the law had taken this away as it had been implemented a new strict annual quota of a maximum of 50 immigrants from the Philippines, which demonstrates the idea that they had been treated as a separate foreign country. The sharp immigration quota had resulted in a huge drop-off in Filipino immigration. Even with the Philippines being colonized by the U.S., Filipinos were legally excluded from America as if they were from a foreign nation. The laws was able to utilize the promise of independence to deceive the Filipinos and use it as a legal justification for the purpose of limiting migration. This demonstrated a complex relationship between both the colonial control power and Filipino desire for self-government. However, even with these complications, there was an important exception: the ability for Filipinos to immigrate to Hawaii. Unlike the mainland, immigration to Hawaii was regulated by the Department of the Interior, which was based on labor demand, not enforced by the strict visa quotas. This exception demonstrates that the economic necessities were able to override racial or political exclusion, which allowed the Filipinos to enter Hawaii in greater numbers, with the exception they were labeled as workers. The enforcement of the Tydings-McDuffie Act had meant that the Filipinos had faced conflicts of quote-unquote alien immigration laws, quotas, inspections, and limited visas, even with the U.S. having political control over their island. They were stripped of the right of being able to enter the U.S. as U.S. nationals and were now vulnerable to brutal restrictions as other foreigners. Overall, the law demonstrated an ugly truth and action of American immigration policy: the fact that even while holding onto colonial power, the U.S. had chosen to exclude Filipinos from full membership in American society. The government had found the ability to use them for work, however did not want to bring them in as citizens, demonstrating that the political status and economic interest had made it clear who was to be brought in the nation. Even with both the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Tydings-McDuffie Act targeting two different groups, these acts had been driven by similar causes such as racial prejudice, economic control, and political convenience. For the Chinese, race and economics had played a big role in the exclusion, whereas the Filipinos' colonial ties could not prevent exclusion as they were not seen as useful for the mainland. Both cases demonstrate that immigrant groups were only welcome when they had served the country's needs and excluded when they had been seen as threats to identity, wages, or political order. Next, we will dive into the Hispanic realm with the Mexicans and Argentinians. Throughout the duration of World War II, the U.S. had faced a labor shortage, primarily in the field of agriculture, as many of the American workers had been away serving in the military. As a solution, the Bracero Agreement was signed in 1942, which permitted thousands of Mexican workers to temporarily enter into the U.S. and fill these spots. This marked an important moment in immigration history, as it was one of the biggest organized guest worker programs of all time. The agreement also made explicitly clear that the American jobs were protected and made known that the braceros could not be used to replace the U.S. workers or potentially lower wages. This is important because it aimed to have a balance between both the labor demands being fulfilled and preventing backlash from the U.S. workforce. The program had promised to keep safe any earnings through a savings fund, which provided the Mexican laborers financial security despite them working away from home. However, the Bracero program reflected a common truth of the U.S. immigration policy, creating a system where workers were essentially disposable, welcoming primarily when they were needed and quickly escorted when they were not. Overall, it is important to note that the opportunity still has its strict boundaries. The workers had been expected to return back to Mexico the moment that their contract had expired. If they had stayed after this point, they were deemed to be undocumented, highlighting the temporary nature of the law. Prior to the 1970s, Argentine immigrants had not specifically been recognized by the U.S. government, rather being classified as a broader category labeled Other Hispanics, meaning that the U.S. did not have any specific stats or policies regarding Argentine immigrants. This treatment of being placed into a larger Hispanic group demonstrated a neutral stance rather than a targeted one. Throughout the 1960s, U.S. immigration policies had been more in favor of skilled as well as educated immigrants who had the potential to contribute economically. With Argentine immigrants fitting this idea, they were able to come to the U.S. no problems at all as well educated professionals who seek better opportunities. This idea is in line with the preference of U.S. immigration laws for skilled labor during this era. By the 1970s, Argentine immigrants had engraved themselves in the identity of urban areas, mainly the New York metropolitan region. A good portion, 20% of Argentine immigrants in the U.S. had lived there. With this development, numerous organizations were created to help new immigrants assimilate more easily, which provided resources and social networks which were important for success in the U.S. It is important to note that there was a significant change which had occurred in the middle and later stages of the 1970s. This change was where many Argentines had fled the country due to political persecution throughout Argentina's dirty war. This group of immigrants was unlike the first wave, where it would then consist of more diverse and less educated immigrants. This demonstrated a shift from economic migration to then political asylum seeking. The change demonstrated both of their experiences in the U.S. and the challenges they had faced. The enforcement of U.S. immigration laws demonstrated the historic favor of skilled workers. This preference had benefited the early Argentine professionals who could obtain legal status and assimilate, compared to the second wave of political refugees who were less educated and had faced more conflicts because of immigration policies favoring higher education and skills. This demonstrates the complex and unfair nature of immigration enforcement, which had formed the immigrant experience depending on their background and reasons for migration. While Mexican and Argentine immigrants came from the same broader region, their treatment under U.S. policy was shaped by different needs, labor versus skill. Mexicans were brought in temporarily through the Bracera program to fill wartime labor shortages, but were seen as disposable once their contracts had ended. In contrast, early Argentine immigrants, often skilled professionals, were quietly welcomed due to U.S. preferences for educated immigrants. Both cases reveal a core truth. U.S. immigration policy favors the usefulness of the people, welcoming them when needed and escorting them when not. Now we will move on to the Haitian and Cuban cases. Through the U.S. asylum law, it had set the requirement that solely people who had been fleeing political persecution would be able to qualify, not poverty. Even with the fact that Haitians had been escaping a dictatorship, instability, and corruption, the U.S. had labeled them as economic refugees, which resulted in them not having the ability to apply for asylum. The disgrace of this law is that it failed to recognize that the poverty within Haiti had been tied to political oppression, meaning that many claims were dismissed automatically without a thorough investigation. The law had excluded Haitians from the beginning, even though many had been fleeing from life-endangering conditions. A major way which Haitians had arrived by would be by boat during the 1970s. Poor and had zero support systems, they had no manner to support themselves legally due to the lack of work permits and rights permitted. The Haitians had primarily depended on either religious groups, labor organizations, and charities for food and shelter. The law did not just reject the ability for asylum, but also forced them into a life and death situation for them to fend for themselves, even during the awaiting of decisions which were pre-made. Unlike all other asylum seekers, the Haitians had been detained immediately, an absolute disgrace to the U.S. The Haitians had not been permitted to wait outside of their cases freely. For them, it was guilty until proven innocent. In 1981, many of them had been confined to Chrome Avenue Detention Center in Miami. With the arrival of more and more Haitians, the detention centers and prisons just simply expanded. The centers were often in poor conditions and had depicted the Haitians as actual criminals. The Haitians had been treated so poorly to the point where they were scattered all across the country in these centers and prisons, far away from any form of help or legal aid. The neglect here experienced made it impossible for the Haitians to fight against the decisions on their cases. Now, let's take a look at what is known as the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966. This was one of the biggest laws in U.S. history that had welcomed immigrant groups, unlike many other immigrant groups who had been forced to await long trials and strict quotas. This law had permitted any Cuban who had been in the U.S. for a minimum of 1 year to have the ability to apply for a permanent residency, ignoring the manner to which they had arrived by. This did not restrict Cubans from immigration, rather provided a fast-pass route for legal status. The law did not have an explicit termination date, which meant that any Cuban immigrant had the ability to benefit for decades. The law had sent shockwaves in terms of impact, with it impacting the people massively. Following Fidel Castro's 1959 communist regime in Cuba, big waves of Cubans had fled to the U.S., a prominent area being Miami. The immigrants had consisted of middle to upper class professionals who had been seeking an escape from political persecution. The U.S. had depicted them to be freedom-seeking refugees, using them for the purpose of a political statement against communism. This was a clear outlier, as many other Latin American immigrants had been seen as economic migrants and had faced harsh punishments and treatments. In terms of enforcement, the law was directly carried out by federal immigration authorities, strongly supported by Cold War-era policies. The government made concerted efforts to make the Cuban immigration as smooth as possible, providing housing, employment, English classes, all funded by the government. The law had worked alongside other Cold War policies. For example, the wet foot, dry foot policy, introduced in 1995, allowed Cubans who reached U.S. soil to stay, but those found at sea were sent back to Cuba. The selective enforcement reinforced the idea that the Cubans had been fleeing a dysfunctional communist government, portraying them as deserving special treatment, not out of ethnic concern, but to strengthen the U.S. political stance. So even though this act had welcomed thousands, it also revealed how foreign policy and ideological battles had shaped who had been seen worthy of entry and support. The difference in how the U.S. treated Cubans and Haitians showed how much politics affected who was welcomed. Cubans fleeing Castro's government were seen as political refugees and could get permanent residency after 1 year because of the Cuban Adjustment Act. They also received help with housing and jobs. Haitians, on the other hand, were called economic refugees and were denied asylum. They had no legal rights and were often put in detention centers, far from help. The U.S. helped Cubans to make a political point against communism, but ignored the struggles of Haitians. This shows how U.S. foreign policy decided who got support. The Irish had never truly been targeted by a single federal law that had actually banned their entry. Rather, their immigration experience had been formed primarily by many native attitudes and state power or informal restrictions in the mid-1800s. There had first been the rise of the Know Nothing Party, which had been based off of an anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant political movement. This demonstrated the efforts of the people to do anything to get away from the Irish influence through voting restrictions and anti-Catholic education laws. It is important to know that the impact was clear. Irish immigrants who were mostly poor, Catholic, and fleeing from Ireland's Great Famine had been barred from many jobs, denied housing, and portrayed as a political threat. Many employers had typically put up signs which had said, "No Irish need apply," displaying how discrimination was widely socially acceptable, regardless of federal statute. There had been a great impact of the policies and attitudes. The Irish had been pushed into many dangerous manners of unpaid labor, as they had dug canals, laid railroad tracks, and did factory work. The Irish had been depicted as drunken, violent, or subhuman in many political cartoons of the era. Many of them had lived in poor conditions, urban slums, degrading them as humans. However, over time, the Irish had been able to build political power through urban machines such as Tammany Hall and force their way into acceptance. For the enforcement part, although there had not been an actual Irish Exclusion Act, enforcement had occurred through voting restriction, job discrimination, and Protestant-driven local laws. For example, many states had attempted to lengthen naturalization waiting periods, or had passed laws to give preference to Protestant-run organizations. Violence had typically been used as a form of enforcement, where nativists would attack Irish neighborhoods. During the early 1900s, the U.S. had started to place more increasingly restrictive laws which were targeted to Southern and Eastern European immigrants, including Italians. Many acts had expanded categories for exclusion and inspection, which had increased the amount of medical and literacy tests at ports such as Ellis Island. Many of the immigrants were targeted as undesirable because of the poverty, low education, and lack of skilled labor that they had brought. The law had unjustifiably impacted Italian immigrants. Many of them had been from rural, impoverished regions of southern Italy and had arrived to the U.S. as temporary laborers. The 1911 Dillingham Commission report had classified southern Italians as less adaptable and more likely to become criminals, demonstrating the growing suspicion to Italian loyalty and cultural fit. Due to the bias of Italians at this time, they had been forced into the lowest wage and most dangerous jobs in construction, mining, and sanitation. Also, they had crowded ethnic enclaves where they had faced police harassment as well as a lack of political representation. Even though they had not been completely banned, their movement and labor options had been extremely limited. Many laws had been very harsh, resulting in immigration officers unfairly detaining and deporting Southern Italians for small reasons such as if they had been sick or lack of finances. The many policies had laid the groundwork for the National Origins Act of 1924, which had severely limited Italian immigration through quotas being set below the existing migration levels. Italians were essentially treated as second-class immigrants under U.S. law. Irish and Italian immigrants both faced a lot of discrimination, but in different ways. The Irish were not banned by federal laws, but faced local rules like voting limits and job discrimination. They were seen as poor Catholics and often saw signs saying no Irish need apply. They worked hard in tough jobs and lived in poor neighborhoods. Over time, they gained political power in cities. Italians faced stricter federal laws in the early 1900s, like medical and literacy tests and quotas, that limited how many could come. Most Italians were poor workers from southern Italy and were seen as criminals and hard to fit in. They got the worst jobs and lived in crowded areas with little political power. Both groups faced hard treatment, but Italians had more government limits, while the Irish faced more social discrimination. Finally, I would like to ask you the question, how do these stories impact your take on immigration? Here is the works cited page for my primary sources used. Here is my works cited page for my secondary sources used.